Summer Sweetheart, Chapter 33. Alisa reflexively stretched out her arm around his neck. Her mind was blank for a few seconds before she realized that what was going on. She struggled to get down in his arms. Luther, you let me down. Carl's arm hugged her firmly without paying attention to her struggle and resistance at all and directly stuffed her into the co-pilot's seat. As soon as Alisa wanted to reach the cushion, she held on to the door frame to get out of the car. Carl had long expected that she would get off the car. He held the car door with one hand and the other hand on the door frame. He smiled and smiled at Alisa. If you dare to get out of the car, I will kiss you. Alisa squeezed the corner of her mouth when she heard the words, gritted her teeth and uttered, shameless. Carl closed the door, walked around to the other side of the car and drove forward. Alisa turned her head to the side and she was too lazy to look at the man next to her, and it was annoying to see him. Carl didn't look at her either. His eyes were straight ahead and his tone was pale. You haven't answered my question yet. Alisa was stunned for a moment, remembering that he asked her in a mocking tone just now if she was going to touch porcelain. Alisa turned her head and glared at him. I think it's you who want to touch porcelain, right? Carl glanced at her, curled his lips and said unclearly, your husband is the most promising man in Rostonville. How dare I ask you to touch porcelain? This sounded like teasing, but it seemed to be a little bit proud. In short, Alisa found Luther very weird. She looked at him carefully, and apart from discovering that he looked like a dog as usual, she found nothing unusual. However, Luther saw her interview so soon. Did Carl also see it? Thinking of this, she felt a little uneasy. The attitude of the Hearn family was obvious from the beginning. After they pressed a few hot searches related to Carl, they did not move their hands. In other words, as long as they did not involve Carl, they would not care about Alisa. In today's interview, the reporters asked Carl's questions a bit too much. Will her self-righteous answers make Carl feel offended? Alisa organized the language and decided to find Luther to check his tone. Your cousin, did he see the interview? Carl heard the hesitation in her tone, gave her a slightly surprised look. His eyes flashed and said, he saw it. Alisa asked tentatively. Carl said naturally, he is very angry. When Alisa heard this, her heart jumped and she became even more disturbed. She looked out the window and found that it was not the way back and asked vigilantly, where are you going? I want to go back to the villa. Carl seemed to have not heard her and ignored her, stopping directly in front of the clinic on the roadside. He got out of the car and opened the passenger's door. Can you get off or I will hold you? Upon hearing this, Alisa quickly bent over and got out of the car. You want to buy medicine? Alisa asked curiously when she saw him walking directly into the clinic. The man walking in front of her ignored her and went inside. Alisa followed and heard him say to the doctor she fell on her knees, help her. Alisa was stunned. Luther drove her to the clinic just to show her legs to doctor. After hearing what he said, the doctor looked at Alisa and said gently, I will help you, come in. Where does it hurt? My leg doesn't hurt so much, it's okay. Alisa couldn't help but look up at Luther as she said. There was no expression on his face and he was not talking. There was a little sharpness between his handsome eyebrows. And he was not at all like a dude, but he had a king of kingly temperament like a king. Such Luther made her panic. After listening to Alisa's words, the doctor looked at Carl again and said with a smile, your boyfriend also cares about you, so just take a look. Alisa immediately retorted, we are not in that kind of relationship. Carl curled his lips, non-committable, and pointed to a female doctor not far away. Let the female doctor help her. The doctor smiled again, showing a clear look, and called the female doctor over. When the female doctor came over, she blushed when she saw Carl, and then very gently rolled Alisa's trouser legs to look at her knees. Her legs were fair and slender, and they were straight. Even the female doctor couldn't help but praise her. Your legs are beautiful. Alisa felt uncomfortable when she thought of Luther standing next to her and put her trouser legs down when she reached out. She also suffered a little redness and swelling in her knees, which was not considered a fall injury to her, and she didn't know which muscle Luther was wrong and had to make a fuss. Turning her head inadvertently, she met Luther's gaze. He glanced at her leg casually. You are quite resistant to falls. At that time, he watched her fall straight to the ground and did not stand up for a long time, thinking that her leg was badly injured. It's very rare. There is no irony in his words, but he's sighing. Although there was nothing wrong with Elisa's legs, the doctor still gave her some medicine and asked her to wipe it back. After leaving the clinic, Carl walked straight to the car door and suddenly turned around and only to find that Elisa was standing at the entrance of the clinic and not following. He turned his head, narrowed his eyes to look at Elisa. Why? My legs hurt so much that I can't walk. Want me to hold it? Elisa felt that her temper was not good in nature, but she had never met a man who was such as shameless as Luther and made her angry so easily. He sullened her face and said, "Thank you today. Go ahead and do what you have. I can just take a taxi and go back by myself." Carl looked at the patience on her face as if admiringly, leaning on the car with a light tone. "I'm not busy, just eat with friends and go together." Elisa turned and left. She knew that there was nothing to say to this man, and she didn't know why he kept pestering her. Does he like her so ugly? Within 2 steps, she heard the voice of Luther coming from behind. He seems to be calling. "I'm outside. I met my cousin to have a meal and come back. Do you mind my cousin? My relationship with her, after all, we meet every day. After Elisa's footstep was stopped, she turned around and saw Luther staring at her with a smile, and the threat was self-evident. She didn't doubt at all. If he took a step forward, he would say, "The cousin seduced me." She clenched her hands and walked to Luther in a swallowing voice. A glimmer of satisfaction flashed in his eyes. "Cousin-in-law, let's get in the car first. I have something to say to my cousin." Seeing Elisa getting into the car, he took the phone to his front. The lock screen was displayed on the screen and it was not displayed during the call. Chapter 34. The car stopped at the door of the high-end secret club. Elisa was about to release the seatbelt and stopped and looked suspiciously at Luther. "Eating here? Is he sure he didn't come here to play?" Carl glanced at her, opened the door and got out of the car. Elisa had no choice but to follow. The two of them walked towards the door, one after another. When Carl walked in front, the waiter bent down respectfully and said, "Welcome." But when it was Elisa's turn, he stopped. Waiter Wisey raised his chin and looked at her, his eyes flashed with contempt. "What are you here for?" Elisa looked down at her dress. She was indeed a bit shabby, but she still said calmly, "Eat." She was going to walk in after she said, but the waiter still refused to let her in. "We are a high-end club here. Not everyone can enter." He could see a lot of gold worshippers who came here to look for a benefactor. But most of these women were pretty, and this one was so ugly and dressed so shabbily. Letting her in was simply a downgrade of the clubhouse. Elisa pouted. She didn't want to go in yet. After Carl went in, he found that Elisa hadn't followed. When he turned to look for her, he happened to hear the waiter's Wisey's words. He walked over and stretched out his long hand to pull Elisa behind him and looked at the waiter just now with a cold face. "What's your name?" Most of the people who come and go in this club are rich or expensive, and they all are very discerning people as waiters here. Carl was tall and had a strong aura, and the waiter was immediately persuaded, stuttering, Wisey." Hearing this, Carl glanced at him, coldly pulled Elisa in, and no one stopped. The other person walked fast with tall legs, and Elisa was much shorter than Carl and was half a step behind him. Unlike his unscrupulous dude, his palms are generous and warm and reassuring. Elisa raised her head and looked at his broad shoulders a little in surprise. Except for Tina, this is the first time someone has protected her like this. Ding. The sound of the elevator door opening pulled her thoughts back. She looked up and found that Carl had stopped at some point, looking at her with unpredictable eyes. Like an electric shock, Elisa quickly retracted the hand she was holding and hurriedly entered the elevator. She was actually led by Luther just now. After Carl got into the elevator, Elisa stood in the corner farthest from him. Carl glanced at her indifferently with a deep voice. "What do you do while hiding so far? Can I eat you?" Elisa turned her head and ignored him. After finally getting to the box, Elisa thought she could finally breathe a sigh of relief, but didn't want other people in the box. The man wears a striped suit and very elegant gold-rimmed glasses. He has handsome features, gentle eyebrows, and an outstanding temperament. As long as anyone involved in the entertainment industry knows this man, he is the CEO of Olympic Media, Peter Grant. Peter seemed to feel her gaze, looked up at her, and smiled gently. Carl walked to the dining table, pulled out the chair, pressed Elisa on the chair, looked up at Peter, and said concisely, "My cousin." Peter seemed to be stunned for a moment, as if he had heard something interesting. The smile lines under his eyes were a bit deeper, but his tone was not light. "Madam." Alisa felt that the atmosphere was little weird, but still politely called out, "Mr. Grant." "Does this ugly woman know Peter Grant?" Carl raised his eyebrows and threw the menu pop at her. His tone was a bit colder. "Order." Alisa didn't know where she had provoked him again, and there were outsiders there and didn't say much. She looked down at the menu seriously. Beep. It is the sound of mobile phone text messages. Carl took out his mobile phone and found that Peter had sent him a text message. "You still play role playing with your wife." Carl was a little upset because Alisa knew Peter Grant. After reading the text message, he lifted his long leg and kicked Peter directly. Peter didn't expect Carl to start so harshly. He groaned in pain, but because Alisa was there, he could only hold it back. Feeling the table shake, Alisa looked up at Carl blankly. "Is the food ready?" Carl leaned over, resting his arm directly on the back of the chair in an intimate manner. Alisa was uncomfortable and said, "It must be ready," and then set the menu far away. Fortunately, during the meal, Luther did not go beyond the rules and kept chatting with Peter Grant about something. It is not difficult to see that the two have a good relationship. Alisa ate hard and found an excuse to go out after eating. As soon as she left, Peter let out a sigh of relief, took off his glasses, changed his previous gentle image, and said madly, "You go home and play role playing with your wife easily, leaving me alone in the company. I don't care about it, and I have to wear glasses every day to pretend to be mature and stable. I don't care. I want to take a vacation." Carl was indifferent. "What kind of vacation does Olympics Media's president take? Even a stuffed bun like Alisa knows you. Shouldn't you work harder?" "Bah. I have tens of millions of fans on Twitter, and there are more people who know me. Besides, you are the big boss of Olympic Media. I just work for you." Peter said, more and more angry, "If you don't return to work at the company, I will go to the rooftop of the Olympic Media to jump off the building and make a big news for you." Peter had to say this threat 3 times a day, and Carl didn't take it seriously. He drank water slowly and then asked, "Really, did the personnel department receive Alisa's job application resume?" Peter was also a little puzzled and said, "I ask the secretary every day, really no." After speaking, he asked Carl curiously again, "Your wife has grown up like that, so can I speak?" Carl raised his eyes and looked at him coldly. "What?" Peter swallowed and said flatteringly, "Clean and beautiful, beautiful and generous." "Carl, are you lame?" "I can't say that Alisa is ugly, nor can I say that she is beautiful. What do you want to do?" He felt that since Carl got married, it was weird. Before leaving, Carl seemed to be suddenly remember something and told Peter, the waiter named Wisey in the clubhouse should be expelled. When they returned to the villa, it was already afternoon. Alisa and Carl went in one after another. She walked in and asked, "Is your master at home?" No. After this period of exercise, the bodyguards have no psychological pressure at all when they lie. Back in the room, Alisa lay on the bed thinking about waiting for Carl to come back and ask about the interview and how she would deal with it. But unconsciously, she thought of Luther. He was abnormal today and suddenly treated her well.